Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. The year is 2025. This is Eisenherz and you are watching episode 6 of my cEDH Masterclass mini-series. Today I'm going over some fundamental principles of threat assessment so you can improve your game. So without further ado, let's get started. With limited resources, limited information and multiple opponents who are all trying to win the game, you need to be able to make an informed decision on which game action, game state or player to focus your interaction on. However, what is perceived as a threat can greatly vary from player to player and situation to situation. So let's have a look at what a threat actually is, how to properly assess threat levels of game actions and game states, and how to use our assessment to make more informed gameplay decisions. In MTG, any game action you take will ideally increase your chances of winning the game, or at the very least reduce your opponent's chances of winning the game. So in essence, every game action your opponents take are threats or make them threats. Even something as simple as playing a basic land, because it will ever so slightly increase their odds of winning the game. For the sake of simplicity, however, only game actions and game states that have a significant impact on who will win the game by lowering your odds of winning and or increasing your opponent's odds of winning will be considered threats. By looking at game actions and game states separately, we are able to differentiate between what card is a threat and which player is a threat. So in that regard, threats can be singular spells such as ramp cards like Soul Ring, Birds of Paradise or Carpet of Flowers, value engines like Mystic Remora, Esper Sentinel or Rhystic Study, stacks and hate pieces like Null Rod, Curse Totem or Archon of Emeria, setup pieces like Wishclaw Talisman, Ranger Captain of Eos or Demonic Tutor, or payoff spells and combo pieces like Necropotence, Ad Nauseam or Underworld Breach. However, threats can also be game states which are affected by the deck your opponents are playing, the mana they have available, the cards they have in hand, the amount of times they have tutored, the game actions they have taken, and the overall board presence they have established. Multiple of these factors combined give you an estimation of which player is the biggest threat. And herein lays a significant interdependency of game action threats and game state threats. While multiple game actions make up the game state threat, you need to fully understand the game state threats in order to assess the threat level of further game actions. The ability to do this fundamentally distinguishes novice, intermediate and advanced players. Obviously, different game actions or game states have different threat levels, like a Tinderwall compared to a Jeska's Will. While both cards ramp, they do so at a very different rate and with different purposes. However, even cards with similar threat levels can be perceived very differently because they have different levels of noise. An example for that would be something like the One Ring compared to Thrasios. Both cards will generate a lot of value for their controller and thereby greatly increase their chances of winning the game. But while the One Ring is perceived as a loud threat and will usually be swiftly handled with, Thrasios is usually perceived as a silent threat and hence will often be left undisturbed for too long. So although both cards will certainly increase the chances of their controller winning the game, they are perceived differently. What is and isn't a threat, and what is perceived as loud or silent also greatly depends on multiple different factors. Understanding these factors will not only allow you to make more informed decisions on when to interact, it will also allow you to optimize your strategy, deck building, sequencing and play patterns, which will subsequently allow you to outplay your opponents. The first factor that affects what is or isn't a threat and what noise level a threat has is the timing and the available resources. Early game threats are usually acceleration cards such as Mana Dorks, Rocks or Draw Engines. In the very early stages of the game these cards are very loud because you will have to factor in the value they will provide over the course of the game. In that regard, using a mental misstep on a Carpet of Flowers or Esper Sentinel or a Stifle on a fetch land against the Rockside player is absolutely reasonable. However, a late game Carpet of Flowers or Esper Sentinel will not be considered a loud threat, or even a threat at all, and hence not draw as much attention towards it. Mid-game threats are often either some kind of value engines, such as Smothering Tithe or something like a Commander or a combo piece or tutor. These cards do not set the pace of the game like early ramp, or carry opponents through the game like early draw engines, but they translate available resources into eventual wins. They allow a player to set up their game-winning turn. In this phase, what is perceived as a threat or considered loud or silent is greatly determined by the available resources and the previous game actions. If an opponent already drew many cards and tutored, their mana rituals are very loud threats. Vice versa, if an opponent has a lot of mana but is lacking cards, any draw effect should be considered a loud threat. By understanding the principle of resource bottlenecks and the law of the minimum, you will be able to determine more reliably what is a threat worth interacting with and what is not. Late-game threats are often game-ending spells such as Ad Nauseam, Breach, or even precursors such as Silence, Ranger Captain of Eos, or Grand Abolisher. When resources are readily available, players have rammed, drawn, and tutored. These precursors or payoff spells will be considered very loud and therefore draw all the attention towards them. On the contrary, a turn 2 Grand Abolisher with no follow-up spell will not draw as much attention towards it, because there are more windows to deal with it before the value it provides translates into an immediate win. Another example for the importance of timing will be casting a Silence in your own upkeep, which will immediately be received as a very loud threat, because it tells your opponents that you are trying to present an undisrupted win, whereas a Silence during an opponent's win attempt is not perceived as an immediate threat. In that regard, a threat is also always depending on what your other opponents are doing. Sometimes you need to let opponent A's Ad Nauseam resolve, which of course is a very loud threat, simply because opponent B has the resources to deal with that Ad Nauseam and is also the overall bigger threat. Forcing opponent B to deal with opponent A will allow you to reduce both opponents' chances of winning and thereby ever so slightly increase your chances of winning by depleting their resources and saving your own. The second factor that determines the threat perception and noise level is immediacy. While some cards are perceived as silent, such as Smothering Tithe, Thrasios, and Tymna, because they will not immediately translate into a win, but accumulate value over multiple turns, which will eventually increase the controllers also winning the game. Cards like Ad Nauseam are considered very loud, because they will usually immediately end the game as soon as they have successfully resolved. These loud threats will often draw out a lot of interaction, but sometimes this might be a trap, because they do not always immediately translate into a win, depending on the current game state. On the other side of the spectrum, silent threats are often ignored for too long until the value they generated can't be interacted with anymore. The immediacy of a game action towards the result of the game is probably the easiest to understand factor when it comes to threat assessment and noise, because it is mostly independent of the timing or game state. However, the immediacy is closely linked to the third factor that affects threat perception and noise levels: the opposing deck's strategy and the opponent themselves. Facing a turbo deck is very different from facing a mid-range or a control deck, and so is facing a creature-heavy combo deck compared to an almost creatureless storm deck. A turn 1 Dark Ritual from a rock-side player often ramps into a Necropotence, which will most likely end the game on turn 2. This turn 1 Dark Ritual from the rock-side player is a much louder threat than a turn 1 Dark Ritual from the Taiam player, because their deck does not allow them to translate the mana into a win as quickly. Different strategies also lead to vastly different board presences and hand sizes. While some decks play very heavily to the board, such as TNT, Derevi, Magda, Taiam, Sisay, and Urza, other decks like Roxai, Inala, or Dihada tend to have a more minimal board presence and accumulate value in their hands or graveyards by drawing, tutoring, and milling, which will eventually translate into an explosive win. The main issue here being that oftentimes board states are perceived as very loud threats, and inexperienced players might overreact to them, whereas the more hidden threats in hands and graveyards will sometimes be underestimated or outright ignored because they are perceived as silent. In that regard, a player who has drawn 5 to 10 cards and tutored twice might be a much bigger immediate threat than the player who has a huge board presence but a low hand size. This is especially true in a meta where explosive instant speed wins have become the norm. Additionally, the pilot also has a huge effect on the perceived threat level and noise of any given game action or game state. Someone who is very reputable as a good player will always draw more attention towards them than someone who is a fairly new and maybe inexperienced player. That's just the side effect of clout you'll have to deal with, but also a reason why new players can sometimes sneak in unexpected wins. And finally, the fourth factor that affects the threat perception and noise level is the deck you are piloting. This is especially true for stacks and hate pieces, because sometimes a piece will not affect you at all, such as a Blood Moon against Urza, or it will affect you to some degree, but outright stop the whole game plan of another player in the pot. This is something to be aware of when trying to understand what pieces you need to take care of, what pieces you can let your opponents take care of, and why certain cards are perceived differently by your opponents. This discrepancy on what is or isn't a threat, or who and what is the bigger threat, can lead to frustrating situations where it's hard to understand why an opponent does or does not interact with another opponent. In order to successfully manage these disagreements, you can try to do the following things. First, try to understand your opponent's perspective by asking yourself, how do they perceive certain threats? Second, try to explain your view. Clarify your reasoning subtly without revealing too much about your priorities. And third, try to direct attention by vocalizing opposing threats to steer interaction towards them while downplaying your own threats. So to summarize, these are the questions you should be asking yourself when trying to assess the threat level of game actions, game states and opponents in general in order to optimally strategize your game plan. Who am I facing? What is their general strategy? What point of the game is it? How do the board state, loud threats and hand sizes, silent threats, compare? Am I overreacting to a loud threat or ignoring a silent threat? Does interacting prevent an immediate loss or set up a future win here? Who is most affected by a threat? Is the impact of my interaction worth spending my resources? How do I manage my opponent's threat perception? I know this is a lot to do in the middle of a game and obviously can't be implemented perfectly at all times, but ideally you will use this information to gradually implement more relevant factors to your already existing threat assessment procedure so that you can make better gameplay decisions every game. And that's it with part 6 of my cEDH Masterclass mini-series. If you have any questions or ideas for future videos, please let me know in the comment section below. And make sure to check out learncedh.com, which is a new website created by my friend Evan, aka Freedom Waffle, that provides an incredibly well-structured and extensive learning experience for anyone that wants to bring their game to the next level. As always, thanks for watching my videos, this is Eisenherz and Auf Wiedersehen.